Welcome back. So, this is our last part of chapter 22, looking at urbanization. In the first two parts, we looked at urbanization, what was it and what it wasn't. And then the second part, we looked at urban sprawl. What was it? What are some modern day examples that we have of it? Now, today, we're going to be looking at why is it that most of the cities out there are unsustainable. It has to do with resource use, waste, pollution, and poverty. Ooh, yeah. So, with that, okay. So we have to look at what are some of the advantages of urbanization before we get down to the downside. So, certainly more job opportunities. You do have better education because it is easier to have access to places like universities, colleges, and trade schools. Let's face it, if you are out in Pahrump, which is located in Nevada, you don't have that kind of access to universities and colleges and trade schools. It's a small desert town in the northern section of Nevada. Okay, there's Gabbs, Nevada, which is a small mining town. Again, it's anything but urban. Okay, that's a mining town there. Now, the other aspect about another advantage for urbanization has to do with better health, because let's be honest, you've got better access to hospitals, you have better access to doctors, okay, EMT services if needed, government programs. And because of that, the connection is you got lower infant mortality and fertility rates as a result. Now, if you think 200 years ago, when you're looking at an agriculturally based place like the United States, it was to the advantage for a farmer and his wife to have lots of kids. How come? Labor, absolute labor. Kids were needed to help work the farm, plowing, harvesting, and all that. But as times changed and there's less rural, less farming going on, more action happening in the cities, then you didn't have a need for as many kids. So the fertility rate went down as a result. But because you have better access in the urban areas for medical care, well, it's not a surprise that you have a lower infant mortality. Now, cost advantages in delivering goods and services. Well, let's be honest. If you're ordering something from Amazon and you're having it shipped here, let's say wherever you are, Upland, Claremont, Rancho, that's not a big deal. If you were having it shipped up to a place that the nearest Amazon center is 200 miles away, guess what? The shipping probably might be a little bit more expensive to do that. Why? Because the truck burns more fuel, and thus there's the costs. So, cost advantages in delivering goods and services. So, not just doing something like Amazon, which I know for a lot of places they tend to have the right, um, they have a flat rate. But think like eBay, for example. If somebody wins something on eBay and they say, we need to figure out your shipping charges, just punch in the zip code of your destination. And voila, the rest is history. Yep. Now, how about recycling? It's way easier to do recycling in an urban area compared to out in the rural countryside. Recycling centers, things like that. Yeah. Now, of course, the other side of the coin is if you look at people and biodiversity, wildlife habitats, if you have more people in the urban area, the biodiversity outside of that urban area tends to stay stable, it's preserved, and it also decreases, it cuts down on the stress on wildlife habitats. Why? Well, because you're not having the family with the four kids running all over in the place where, grizzly bear roams. Um, if they're in the city, the grizzly bear has an easier time because the habitat is not so messed up. The grizzly bear has an easier time finding food, a mate, etc., etc. Okay, so there are advantages about putting people, oh, excuse me, more concentrated in an area because it's less stress on the outside of the area in the rural, especially for like wildlife, plant life, things like that. Okay, what's the downside of urbanization? Well, you got a concentration of people. It's not exactly self sustaining. While the average urban dweller occupies maybe 2% of the Earth's area, they do consume 75% of the resources. And because of that, there's a high waste output. Well, just think about it for a moment. Think about things that you buy that come in packages of plastic, cardboard, that you're shaking your head and saying, "Wow, this is designed to prevent people from stealing the stuff." But it's also not easy to go and open up the package, and it's a lot of plastic that gets thrown away. And that's part of that high waste output. That's just starters. Think about leftover food, clothes that are no longer usable. You can't donate it. Okay. Maybe you can't make a cleaning rag with it. So what happens is you get a high waste output. So that'll include the trash that we put out, right? Now, the other part of the thing is this is where we start looking at what happens to the land. Because if we're going to sustain the urban area, that means large areas of land, it has to be disturbed and degraded. Okay? And that provides food, energy, water, and minerals, etc. But wait, what do you mean? By a large ecological footprint. The ecological footprint, the idea behind that is how much of the Earth's resources does it take to keep you going, to keep you alive? Clothed, food, shelter, all that. How much of the Earth's natural resources does it take? That is your ecological footprint. Okay? So, providing things like food, energy, water, minerals, a large amount of land has to be disturbed and it's going to get degraded because we're going to use it to get the raw materials, whether it's growing food or we're getting resources. Okay. Again, your urban dweller is consuming about 75% of the resources, even though they occupy about 2% of the Earth's surface area. So there is a downside about urbanization. That is true. People use more, and thus there's more stress placed on the land. Okay, that tends to degrade the land, it tends to lessen the quality of the land. And that's where you have that large ecological footprint as a result. Now, the other part of the thing is flooding tends to be greater in cities. Reasonably so. But why? A lot of cities tend to be built on floodplains or coastlands. Now, if you look at that picture there, there's an example of a city where they are experiencing some rainfall there, torrential rainfall, because you got all that water there. Okay. Now, it sounds crazy, but wait a minute. The floodplains, what are floodplains? Well, those are flat areas of land that every so often you have this flood of water coming to you. Okay, this flood of water. All right, you also have coastlands where you have the tsunami. Okay, you got that too. So the question now comes down to is why would anybody in their right mind want to build in an area where you're more likely to get flooded, you're more likely to get a tsunami or maybe some kind of a, storm from the ocean? Why would you do that? Because those areas like the floodplains and the coastlands, people can get food. They have a better chance of getting food. If you're living on the coastlands, chances are you're fishing to get your food. You may do some growing, you may do some farming, but let's face it, boys and girls, your main food comes from the ocean. So you're going to fish, and you may go to other places and trade the fish for things like fruit and vegetables. Okay. Now, what about the floodplains themselves? Well, the floodplains would, they're bringing in, the water is bringing in dirt from the mountains. Okay. And it makes that area good soil. And when you have good soil, you're going to grow great crops, which means more food for you and your family. So that's why cities tend to be built on floodplains, because they can count on the water that's there, they can count on the soil that's there, and every so often you get a massive flood. Great example, Egypt. Egypt has a lot of agriculture along the banks of the Nile, but there are times that the Nile is going to get more water than it normally would, and then of course the agricultural land gets messed up. That's why flooding tends to be greater in the cities because of that. All right. So what's another problem about what's another problem with urbanization? Yes, I'm tired. You got pollution, and pollution like the water, air, solid wastes, hazardous wastes. Okay, so solid wastes. Think of things that you throw away when you open up the box of top ramen noodles, for example, and you dump that in, or you decide to have oh gosh, Nissan's ramen. Okay, you're throwing away the package. You have the monosodium glutamate flavor packet. You're throwing away that too. The little envelope. Guess what? That's solid waste. Okay. You decide to finally, in a moment, you decide to throw away all of Grandmaster C's CDs. Okay. That's more solid waste that you have. Now, what about hazardous waste? Hazardous waste would include things like medical waste that you would get from the hospital, used needles, used dirty linen, blood soaked bandages, things like that. But hazardous waste would also refer to sewage. Well, wait, what do you mean by sewage? Um, Poop, urine, those would be considered hazardous waste. It's a biological hazard. Okay, so that's something to consider. What if you have a nuclear power plant that's near the town? Guess what? You got nuclear waste. That's also hazardous waste. What about a chemical factory that's making something and you have hazardous waste coming out of there too? So, those are all examples of pollution. So, noise pollution, on the other hand, you don't want it, and it's disturbing or harmful sounds that adversely impacts the quality of life. Could be the sound of airplanes, could be the sound of motor cars. Okay. I knew a guy who had a house in Burbank that was close to the Burbank airport, known as the Bob Hope International Airport. It only operates during the daytime, it does not operate at night, unlike LAX, okay, or Ontario International Airport, which I like way better than LAX. But anyways, but the thing is, when the city wanted to do something to the airport, one of the things that they did was put in better windows in the homes of the people who were near the airport. Okay, why? To cut down on the noise pollution. Oh yeah, real world. Yeah. Of course, when you're looking at the city, when you're building buildings, it does affect the local climate. Cities tend to be warmer, rainier, foggier, and cloudier than suburbs. Hey, we live in the suburbs, right? Nearby rural areas. Okay. How come? Uh, Buildings and pavement, lack of green space. If you've ever heard of the concrete jungle, there you go. You got a lot of concrete, you have a lot of asphalt. Okay, you don't have plants really growing, there's nothing really nature there. Okay, now the other problem is that cities produce heat, creating an urban heat island. Well, wait a minute, what do you mean cities produce heat? Part of it has to do with um, air conditioning units, power generators. They release hot air, warm air into the atmosphere. Okay, that's part of it. But the other part is if you're in a sunny area, what does concrete do? Concrete will reflect sunlight. Yeah. So that kind of warms up the place. If you have asphalt that's a dark color, guess what? That absorbs solar radiation, and that means more heat. Yeah. So that is a bit of a problem. So when we look at cities, they are surrounded, you can look at it as an island surrounded by cooler suburban and rural areas. That makes absolute sense. So this is where we talk about the urban heat island effect, which is exactly what I mentioned to you here. Okay, so if you look on the left of the diagram, the surface absorbs more heat. You got less cooling from evaporation and plant transpiration because you don't have that many plants in the urban area. There's less ground storage of the rainfall. How come? Because the surface is paved with concrete or asphalt, so the water's got to go somewhere and it's not going straight down. Now, if we look at the rural side, the surface will absorb less heat. That's true. Some of it will bounce. Greater cooling from evaporation and plant transpiration. See, plants are natural air conditioners too, in their own way. Tree shade is great for air conditioning. Okay. And of course, when you have the open ground like you have on the rural area, guess what? You can store more rainfall there as a result. Whereas in the urban area, you can't do that. So, wow, that's a great question to know about the urban heat island effect. Other problems. Well, guess what? You're burning fossil fuels. That means you've got more CO2 and you have more soot concentrations. Okay? So it's true that if you got more CO2 going into the air, it does increase plant growth because of photosynthesis. But at the same time, it can worsen the asthma. Now, on the other hand, when we look at soot, remember soot is basically ash when you're burning things like coal. Okay, it's little particles that go up. They'll carry pollen, mold, and other things that cause allergies. That's what an allergen is, into the lungs. Yeah, we do breathe that stuff in. It's part of living in an urban area. Okay. And I told you guys before about air pollution, growing up in LA. It wasn't fun. All right. Now, so what difference does it make? Well, we talk about childhood asthma rates. They have definitely climbed in recent years. Why? Because we've had more pollution, more CO2, more soot that's growing. So, how do we fix it? Well, there's still more. Okay. We also look at artificial light causing light pollution. It does affect plants and animals in terms of their normal plant and animal time of the day, their rhythm. Okay. It does affect the aquatic ecosystems and decrease water quality as well. It also affects stargazing. Okay. So if you look at the difference here in these two pictures, this is a urban area. Okay, San Jose. Here's San Jose, California. This is light pollution. Okay, so it's really hard. You get to pick out a few stars. You'll be able to pick out the moon easy enough. Maybe like the planet Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars. Those you can, if you know where to look and you can recognize it, you can find those. But when you're looking here with a light pollution of level 1, okay, in the Death Valley region, and in all the years growing up and I messed around with telescopes, the desert is still the best place to view the nighttime sky. It's cold, but the beauty that you see that you don't get to see in the city. What is stargazing? It's taking that telescope and looking at the nighttime sky and seeing stuff. And there's a lot of things to see out there. What an awesome creator we have. Urban areas. Okay, here we go. Urban areas can also intensify social problems and poverty. How? Well, when you're getting more people in an area and you don't have enough resources for people, some people may turn to dealing with their problems like booze and drugs. And the problem is that those habits are not cheap. And if they don't have the money, they will go and possibly commit crime, which is why you get a higher crime rate. Okay. Now, the other side of the coin is you also have more desirable target for terrorist attacks. Look, I still remember, I know exactly where I was and what I was doing on September the 11th, 2001. Okay. So, yeah, cities can be more desirable targets for terrorist attacks. And that's just the reality of it. Okay, it says end of chapter 22 for the AP exam. You're right. I'll talk a little bit about sustainability and a few other things, but we're almost at the end of our journey together. So, as I speak to the future, you listen to the past in your present. I'm signing off.